In the old days, if you had a movie and it came out in theaters and it did box office, that was your metric for success. If you had a TV show and it was on television, you'd get a rating, maybe it would get sold internationally, money would come in, there was a clear metric for success. Those metrics for success have disappeared because of the economics, or at least the way streaming platforms were so concerned about subscribers, because subscriber and subscriber growth became linked to stock price.
There are a number of factors affecting the economy, affecting the industry right now that are changing the way that films are made, produced, financed, and distributed. And Imagine has moved from the traditional studio model very excitedly and entrepreneurially into the independent film production and financing and distribution space. So, Justin, thank you very much for being here. This is going to be a great conversation.
That was a great intro, I feel like. Any questions? Are we good? I think we're done. We covered it all.
Let's start with what's going on out there that's maybe causing companies like yours to rethink their traditional, highly successful business model. What's the view from 10,000 feet?
It's a really good question, and it's certainly been a topic of conversation through another panel I was just in the audience for, specific to documentaries, where someone asked the question, is the golden age of content over? Are we sort of at the other side of that? And there was a filmmaker on the panel who said, you have to look at history. Because of the history of this medium, there's been many moments that have been described as golden ages, and there's been probably equally as many moments that people described as a downturn. So I sort of look at it, there's two columns, right? The glass is half full or it's half empty, depending on how you're going to look at it. So in the half empty category, there's a tremendous amount of consolidation that the industry at large has just gone through. Platforms no longer exist anymore. Studios are rapidly changing shape. A studio like Paramount might not exist next week in its current form. There's less buying across the board. There's much more of an emphasis on stock price, economics related to streaming, and all of these downward pressures have really impacted the amount of content that's getting commissioned and the budgets for the content that is getting commissioned. So if you're a producer, you're just getting squeezed every which way. But on the other side, and it's interesting coming from the screening of Megalopolis this morning, which whether you've seen it or you haven't seen it or you're going to love it or you're going to hate it, it's an independently financed movie. And not too long ago, go back 40, 50 years ago, that same filmmaker was a young independent filmmaker who was working in the Hollywood system with some friends of his. Martin Scorsese was one of his friends. Arthur Penn was one of his friends, and many others from that generation. And the studio landscape looked kind of similar to the way it does now, in that all of the studios, all the majors had been bought by some sort of larger corporation, mostly managed from the East Coast, Gulf and Western sort of being the most famous example of that. Stock prices were down. The movies that had been made, big budget musicals, big budget westerns, weren't the pictures that were performing at the box office. And yet you had this group of young creative producers, directors, writers that were eager to tell stories. And you had an audience that was eager for those stories. So the problem wasn't the filmmaking, and the problem wasn't even is there an audience to see it. The problem was the in-between. And there's actually this great quote from Arthur Penn, who, amongst many things, wrote and directed Bonnie and Clyde. He says, the system wasn't just sick, the system was sick of itself. And that's kind of where we are today. You go to any buyer, any platform, everybody's scared. I'm making generalizations when I say everybody, but for the most part, people are scared. People are scared of losing their job. They've already gone through so many rounds, from COVID to the strikes in the United States, just perpetuating and in some ways accelerating trends that were already happening, and the economics haven't caught up to those trends yet. So here we are as a company that's completely dependent on the studio business, historically speaking, and yet, like many filmmakers probably in the audience and producers here, we have stories that we want to tell, and we know that there's an audience out there that wants to connect with it. So over the last few years, we started to look at other paths to get our pictures made, both in the narrative space, but actually beginning in the documentary space, because there was just a lower bar to entry financially. And in a lot of ways, some of the docs that we started to do where we were investing ourselves or we were bringing in financing partners and then setting them up either as licenses, negative pickups, we started to see that becoming a real business for us. So we've started to apply that same methodology to now the narrative side of the business. And it's exciting.
All right, so give us a little bit of an idea as to what we really mean by independent film finance. What does it consist of? What are the components? How does it work? And sort of what are the steps?
Sure. On the most basic level, our job as producers is to produce, to actually make something. That's in the definition of the word producer, producteur, it's to produce. You have to actually make something. So the first part of our job is, well, what are we going to make? And then the second part is, how are we going to actually make it? So having the resources, and in our case, we put our own money on the line to start. We started optioning IP, our own IP. Traditionally, we'd go to the studio and say, hey, there's a great book that we want to develop. Studio, can you pay for this book? We want to hire a writer. Studio, can you hire the writer? We want to bring in a director. Studios were responsible for financing all of that. So we said, we're going to start doing that ourselves. And what that enabled us to do was to keep projects moving through the pipeline, take projects much further through the development cycle without being beholden to the time frame and whatever politics were happening on the studio side. So that when we took these projects to market, and in some cases it meant fully completing a project, and I'll give an example of that in a second. And in other instances, it's just packaging a project up. So now we have a script, we have a director, we have a star. Let's go take that to market. And now the question isn't studio, name your favorite studio, do you want to develop this project? It's, are you going to make this project? And if you don't want to make it, well, then we're going to make it over here because it's ready to go.
So in many ways, it's giving you extra freedom in the creation, the development, and the production of your projects by not being constrained within the studio system at a time when the studios are somewhat pulling back.
No, that's right, and it's being much more entrepreneurial, and that's why coming to a market like this is so exciting, because you start to see there are so many different ways that you can actually get a project made. You don't have to just go in door number one, and in fact, every project is going to have its own set of economics. Every project's going to have its own path to eventually getting to an audience. It's not one size fits all, and this puts us much more in the driver's seat.
You mentioned the studios. I'd like to also ask you to talk about the streamers and what that means for independent film producers, especially individual independent film producers, and how that sort of reshuffles what the metric of success really is for independent producers.
Well, look, that is a very good question, and it's an impossible question to answer right now, because in the old days, if you had a movie and it came out in theaters and it did box office, that was your metric for success. If you had a TV show and it was on television, you'd get a rating, maybe it would get sold internationally, money would come in, there was a clear metric for success. Those metrics for success have disappeared because of the economics, or at least the way streaming platforms were so concerned about subscribers, because subscriber and subscriber growth became linked to stock price. But what we're seeing, and this is, again, I put this both, it could be a negative, but I actually think it's a positive, there's a resetting of all that as everyone's trying to figure out how to actually make these businesses work. It was interesting, if you saw Disney's earnings just a couple days ago, it's the first quarter that Disney Plus is actually profitable. And that is encouraging to see. Now, they've pulled back considerably on spending, but they're leveling. And if they can actually be in the black making content and distributing content, then that ecosystem is working. So to me, that was encouraging. But what we're also seeing, again, on the more entrepreneurial side, platforms don't need to own everything in all media perpetuity worldwide. They don't need to necessarily even pay a premium for something. So that means we can license content. That means we can start windowing content. That means that we can sell content territory by territory again. And in some instances, on the narrative side, theatrical can still be part of that equation if we believe that a film has that kind of commercial viability, and maybe we want to bet on ourselves and do a deal that would be advantageous if there was box office. Or we could still walk in the door of a streamer and say, here's a project that we know we're going to be able to make at this price point. We're not asking for a premium over this, but we're going to license it to you. We're going to put some limitations on your scope of rights. So again, we're more in the driver's seat.